Hey everyone, welcome back to DrewDrawz. Today I'm diving into a full real-time piece using pan pastels, soft pastels, and of course my pastel pencils. I'm going to be using all that to draw this obviously adorable puppy. As you can see, it doesn't look like much with the little stencil I've got on there, of course. However, if you're the kind of person who loves slowing things down, seeing full process of things from start to finish, well, I guess you're in the right place. This video is intentionally long, actually, and pretty much uncut. Maybe I'll cut out like some of the volume of my TV show in the background and whatever else, me cursing at my kids or something, me being on the phone or whatever. Yeah, so you can either just relax, watch this piece come to life in real time. You can draw along, learn at your own pace, I guess. I'm going to kind of go over a couple things, I guess, and this is the first time I've uploaded a full-length video for everybody. So before we get started, I'm just quickly going to go over the materials that I'm using, and then we're get right into the sketch here. So obviously I just said I'm using, some soft pastels. I think I use them a little bit in this, and pastel pencils, of course, for details and stuff. And for the background right now, I'm actually using the pan pastels. Now, the pan pastels, in my opinion, they're kind of like paint. You can keep blending over top of them as long as you're not putting them on too thick right from the hop. Less is more, essentially, when you're first applying it. And you can actually use other mediums over top, whether they're colored pencils or, obviously more pastels, stuff like that. I have yet to put a wet medium over top to try that out, such as, oil paints or acrylics or watercolors. And I'm really not too sure how that's going to work out. But, one day I will try something. I don't mind experimenting. And the canvas paper I'm essentially using is Clairefontaine is the brand, and it's pastel matte. So for pastel matte, I'm told, and from what I've researched, is the best paper to use so far, I guess, the most popular to use for pastels. Now, I've used Bristol. I've used a couple different textures before I found out about pastel matte. I've used a few different textured papers, and the Bristol was okay when I was mixing it with colored pencils and stuff. But pastel matte for the win, for sure. It has like really nice tooth on it, so you can put a lot of layers on top. And I believe now there is another brand out. I'm not too sure who makes it. And I've watched a few videos on it, but I don't have a very good memory with a lot of things. And, some people say that it's better. Some artists say that it's equal or not as good. At this point, I'm quite sure that it's, personal preference kind of sort of thing. Yeah, so obviously the blending tool. It's a sponge applicator and stuff, and a lot of the times you'll see me going in with like my finger. Sometimes I wear gloves, rubber gloves, not rubber gloves, but nitro gloves, and sometimes I just use my actual skin and I try and get some blends in that way, I guess. Yeah, I guess I can try and call out some brand names and techniques as I go, I guess. But yeah, so basically first thing, as you can see, I'm using the pan pastels with the sponge applicator. And again, I'm just like putting a little bit on the tip of that sponge to kind of, lay down the first, maybe second layer of things. And you can see that it's kind of easy to blend for the most part with a lot of colors. I went in with like a really nice soft peachy pink tone. Blending it with a little bit of like a sky baby-ish blue, I guess. And I'm going back and forth with these colors on the sponge. Now, the one thing you don't want to do is go dark on the sponge and then try to go light, because you are going to muddy up the colors a lot. So it really depends on how dark of the tone you're going to be switching back and forth to with these light tones, if I make any sense. So of course I'm going to be, kind of pausing here and there, not the actual video, but, I'll have some like music going in the background or something just to kind of set the mood, I suppose. And yeah, there's only so much I can really say here. Just if you're interested in starting, working with this kind of medium and stuff, and you can essentially get this technique, of course, with soft pastel sticks. You just have to do a lot of blending. You just have to kind of, trial and error. But I find for me, I purchased the entire set of the pan pastels, and originally, when I was interested in purchasing that set, I was heavy into the Copic markers, colored pencils and stuff. And I know, yes, you can still work with colored pencils and pastels at the same time, but I was going to simply use these as an undertone to start replacing my Copic markers, just because I liked the more soft, subtle look of everything instead of, for some pieces, for especially animal portraits, I'd like the soft kind of feel to it rather than a really punchy, fully highly pigmented look, if that makes any sense. Now, sometimes I've done drawings in the past, obviously, with previous videos of, tattoo designs and, just some crazy designs that are very tattoo influenced, of course, me being an artist. Now, some of those pieces absolutely recommend being very punchy and, very bright, vibrant, high contrast and stuff. But, yeah, for animal portraits, I'm finding I like the texture, the feel, the mood, and everything of the soft pastel. And yeah, so again, with this technique I'm doing here with the sponge, you can still get that with the pastel sticks. But I just find the pan pastels are, they're just really easy to work with. They are quite expensive. Now I'm in Canada. I believe I spent over $600, maybe give or take, on the entire set, but totally worth it. And they go a long way. All right, so I'm just gonna back off here and let you listen to a little bit of music in the background, I guess, and set the mood, and I will come back when I need to. back. So right now, as you can tell, I'm obviously starting on the portrait itself. So I'm laying in some of the lightest to mid-tones first. I guess it depends on the actual portrait and the lighting of everything, and what I feel is the most important tone to get in there first. So think of it kind of like this, as like establishing the first lighting kind of before going deep in with the shadows. Does that make any sense? Like, as you can tell, I put a little bit of a darker tone there first, and then like a mid-tone, and then I added a lighter tone there to kind of blend in. But again, depending on the actual portrait. And as you notice, the little sponge on the end there, I flipped it because it's dark pastel stains on the one side from the background. And I believe these sponges you can actually kind of wash, and they may not go white again, fully white, but they absolutely won't bleed out once they are dry. So for all this blending, a lot of times, and I used to make this not mistake, but I used to do it as well, and think that I needed to fully blend and get like a final blend right off the hop. And I'm learning that that's not the case. And keep in mind, I did say learning, and I am still learning as I go. No matter how good or poor these designs look, whether it's pastels or any medium I'm working with, I'm always learning. But that said, I'm figuring out with pastels, depending on the drawing that I'm doing, whether it's a portrait or anything else, that you don't need to have a perfect blend right away. I'm, like I said, using them as more of an undertone, and then the full details essentially come in with the pencils. And that's where I start to bring everything to life. And I always, one thing I always keep in mind when drawing fur is you've got to like follow the growth direction. Shorter strokes around the nose, and longer swoops for the ears and stuff. And of course, this does matter on the actual breed of the animal. You got to get that puppy fluff, just right. So, but this dog in particular, it's shorter hair on certain spots, and some spots it's got longer fur hair kind of sort of thing, and then mixed in with a little bit of short hair as well with those long hairs, if that makes any sense. So So if you find the pastels start getting muddy, at a certain point in your drawing or whatever, just take a break, go to the washroom break, have a drink, do whatever you got to do. Take a break, clean your hands, your tools, obviously put a new sponge on. And I will say these sponges are very cheap on Amazon. You can buy replacement tips for them. And a little artist hack here, you don't need to purchase those either. You can actually use Q-tips or just use the tip of your finger as well. It works just as good. You could simply wrap a Kleenex or a nice soft toilet paper, tissue paper, even I don't know, I've never tried it, but paper towel. You can wrap that around your finger too and blend it that way. But I find sometimes it's very useful to use the skin, like your actual skin, and assuming your hands are clean, but sometimes the oils from your skin can help. Actually, it sounds kind of weird, but they can help blend and get like a certain effect that I'm going for, I guess, sometimes. All right, so we've got basically the funnest part of any portrait, in my opinion anyway. So number one, we've got the eye. So I generally like to start out with the eyes first, and I try to do that with almost every single portrait, human or animal, but sometimes that's not the case. Now, I have done pastel portraits and normal portraits with colored pencils and stuff where I have started with the eye. And I just found that I could do it at that time with that certain piece I'm doing. But for this one, I just took a different approach. Like I said, I decided to do the whole undertone thing of the entire portrait first. So you get to see the eye now instead of right off the hop. But with any portrait, the eye is definitely, the funnest part, in my opinion. Now, this goes for pastels. It goes for anything. If I'm doing a drawing, let's just break it down. We're going to say a drawing in general. or especially a tattoo. The eyes are there's a gateway to the soul. So for me, it's the funnest when you make them look wet and glossy. You can get a reflection in there depending on how big it is, of course. Now this one's a fair size, so it's definitely my favorite thing. And just watching it come to life, and it gives any face, any living being life, in my opinion. And also, this, again, being my favorite part of the whole thing, is using the pencils. Just because, whether it's an eye, a nose, a mouth, fur, skin, whether it's, soft blends or using, pores on the skin and stuff like that, it's my favorite part. And yes, I like doing the undertone as well because I box things in. I'm starting to build my shapes and, have some fun with it. But I absolutely love using the pencils. And you're going to see why, with this portrait in particular, the reflections, as you can see, it's not just, the color of the eye itself that it would be naturally when looking at an eye, and then some black with a white highlight at all. You have to take into consideration what reflection you're going for, what reflections you want in it. If you are copying a portrait, or doing a commission piece or whatever, you can see blues and grays, whites. There's just like light grays that are so light they're almost white. There's browns in there, and I believe I left a little bit of negative space, us tattooers like to call it. And in that term, meaning when we tattoo you, the pigment is saturating your skin. Now, the negative space would be skin tone. So in the corner of the eye there, towards the nose, you see that little gray shape there? That's the actual color of the paper. And I believe I left it like that because it was generally that color. And there is no point of me putting pigment on that part of the paper or canvas when it's already that color. And the one thing that I try and go for is any portrait I'm doing that's color. Fortunately, with pastel matte, you can get different colors of canvas, of paper. Now, I don't know, I believe they have, maybe we're going to say ballpark 8 to 10 different colors. Correct me if I'm wrong in the comments. But the pack that I buy comes with, I believe, 4 or 5 different tones of paper. So now if you're going with, like I drew a cat and stuff, and it was like a kind of like a tabby cat and stuff. So I used a more orangey browny kind of paper for it. And so it gives it like an undertone just with the paper alone. So now you have less saturation and you're going through less materials. So that's a pro tip for anyone that wants to start the pastels and use the pastel matte for sure. It definitely helps. And especially with the pan pastels, like I said, they go a long way, and it may look saturated, like you've put down tons of pigment, at the end of the drawing and stuff, which realistically you didn't, and it looks amazing, I think, anyway. And then if I'm doing like charcoals and stuff like that, and if I'm using a pastel matte for charcoals, and yes, I do mix charcoals with my pastels as well, they blend very, very good with each other. I generally like to stick with, you can buy a light gray, charcoal gray, and a dark gray. I think they actually have a black pastel matte as well. All right, so now that we've got the base layer down with the pan pastels, this nice soft blend of light and mid-tones, you know, I got all my base tones in there. It's time to start building in the fur textures using the pencils. Now, for materials that I use for the pastel pencils, my go-to have been the Carbothellos. I find that they are a little bit softer, and they're just kind of really easy to blend and work with, in my opinion. Now, I'm told that the Caran d'Ache are even softer and very nice to work with, but I'm not gonna lie, I went on Amazon to try and purchase them, and they're like $800 right now. So I'm definitely not gonna do that, and we will wait. But I think you can actually order them from, you know, art store websites and stuff like that, and they're still like, you know, $400 or $500 Canadian. But I'm not in a rush. I don't care. What I have right now is working, and when the time is right, I will purchase the Caran d'Ache. So no, I have not tried those yet, but I'm assuming they're very good because I have the Caran d'Ache Luminance pencil set, and the colored pencils are amazing. And to the left, as you can see, I use the Faber-Castell, the Pit Pastels. Those, excuse me, those are great for fine details, I find, and mixed with charcoal pencils. I use a woodless charcoal pencil, and that's a high black, I guess it is, and I can get crazy details in there with those. And I use a white charcoal pencil as well. But for the most part, for those the pencils, the pastel pencils, those are the two main ones that I use right now, the Carbothellos and the Faber-Castells. And I don't think I did use soft pastel sticks for this one. And, you know, I drew this one a little bit ago, and I'm just doing the voiceover now. So kill me in the comments if you like. But when I do use them, I have Rembrandt. Now I find those, they say that they're just soft pastels, but they're not very soft. They seem a little harder, so I don't use them for a lot of like soft blends and stuff. Now I use Paul Rubens. They're cheap. They're like $25-$35 Canadian on Amazon. I got 2 different sets, and they're handmade. That's what they say, hand rolled, handmade, whatever. And those are actually pretty darn good. But I don't think I used them for this one. The pan pastels act like an underpainting here, like I explained earlier. It gives us depth and softness, and then when you come in and define the structure with these pencils, like think of it like sculpting with light and shadow, but with fur or hair, you know. So with the pencils, I don't necessarily start off with a dark, with a light, with a mid. Again, depending on whatever the portrait is, I kind of just, you know, depends where I start to build all these details and fine textures and stuff. So I gotta just kind of go from there and figure out it. Like most of the time it would probably be like a mid-tone and in between, and then I'll go in with probably darks, and then use some highlights with not necessarily white, but an off white or a very light color of the nearest dark tone. And then I'll come back in. I'll switch back and forth between the darks and lights and stuff until I get that texture of contrast and highlights where it looks really good. So I obviously follow the natural flow of any kind of hair or fur, like around the eyes, under the chin, across the muzzle. All those subtle curves matter if you want it to feel basically believable. What we're going for here is clearly a more realistic approach, with any portrait. So, as you can see, I'm also using like a short directional stroke. And I find sometimes you can kind of go off beat a little bit depending, and it makes it look a little bit more believable. But I think here around the eyes, it's really directional. So you want to kind of follow that bone structure, the muscle structure, of that eye socket and everything, the bones above it. So you always want to kind of go directional there. So they're kind of like little flicks, I guess you could say. I'm using very little pressure to mimic the hair pattern. I'm not pushing very hard, and the harder you push, the more pigment you're going to push into the tooth of that paper, and you're going to be able to put less and less layers on top. So again and again and again, less is more. You can always put more on top, but once it's down there, it's harder to take it off. And yes, I've used an eraser and stuff like that, a kneaded eraser, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. So, but of course, depending on where I am in the portrait and what stage I'm at and how far along I am, I vary the pressure, lighter touch, obviously, in the highlight areas. When you're doing whites for a super white highlight, you like barely any pressure, and where I want depth and contrast, like the darker tones, like say I'm going in with not even a black, but like a really dark brown or really dark gray, I don't necessarily push harder. I kind of just go over it more, and when I tattoo, I kind of do the same thing. And I know it sounds barbaric, but it's actually not. So if you're putting very little pressure, you're not scarring that skin. But I'm not going to get too far into that because I could go on all day. But we'll leave that for maybe a tattoo video. So, and you don't want anything to be super perfect right away. Again, when you're putting in little pressure and more layers, the more layers you put on top, the more it's going to start to come together and look a lot more polished anyways, without trying to just make it perfect right off the hop. And I find that that's a mistake that a lot of artists make, and I'm guilty of it as well. I've always tried to just make it perfect right away, and it's honestly very stressful. So, but yeah, back to the fur. When you actually look closely at a dog, and I don't mean like close up, I just mean just pay attention to the fur and stuff on their body and stuff. The fur, it's layered, it's messy, that's what makes it look real. So you kind of want to do the same thing, but again, in certain areas you want it to be directional. You know what I mean? I'm kind of all over the place here, and forgive me because it's a 3-hour video. I'm not going to sit here and open my trap for 3 hours and talk. I'm going to do my best, but I can only do so much until I'm a pro at this. So again, right now I'm just layering. You're going to see me switch between 2-3 pencils close in value to create variation. But that's the key. It keeps the fur from looking flat and too drawn on, I guess you could say. So if you're new to this, here's a bit of a tip. Keep your strokes loose at first. And yeah, it's tempting to try and render everything in one pass, like I said earlier. But building up those layers gives you way more control over the final texture. I cannot stress that enough. And to be honest with you, working with colored pencils more than pastels, it takes a lot more layers and finesse with colored pencils, because of the lead, the pigment and stuff like that. We don't use pastel matte with that much tooth on our paper, So I personally use Bristol, the 300 or whatever it is. It's very smooth, so you need to be very, very light and tons and tons and tons of layers with those. So this is a little bit more forgiving, but again, very, very soft. See, I always can't help myself. I always stare at those eyes, and it always draws me back to it, and I try and plow some more highlights over top, and I just want it to pop a lot more. Yes, you get good quality from this camera, but it does not see what my eyes are seeing, and man, oh man, they look really good. But later on, I'm going to come back with some darker tones to deepen the shadows, everywhere, obviously, under the ears, stuff like that. Around the edges of the snout. And then I'll use a white or like a cream or something like that to pull out the bright strands for that soft puppy fluff. Also, notice how in certain areas that I've already put some fur texture, do you notice how some of the pan pastel still kind of shows through in certain spots? And that's totally okay. Like I said before, sometimes the paper will come through and the undertone, and in this case it's the pan pastel, and that's totally okay. So it's even helpful. It gives kind of like an atmospheric softness behind the more defined pencil strokes. And again, you don't want to cover everything completely. Sometimes it's about balance, and those little imperfections can make things look more believable, so this part you're going to see, like the eye and that top part of the head there, you're going to notice it start to come together. It's starting to get more of a real fur look, that texture, and it's all in the rhythm. Layer, blend, adjust, repeat, layer, blend, adjust. It's kind of meditative, once you get into it. Not that drawing is not, drawing and painting absolutely is, especially for me, and I can probably say that for pretty much 99.9% of all artists, and that's why we do it, but when you get lost in that moment, I don't think there's any better feeling. Do you remember when I spoke and I said, you know, sometimes I'll start with a mid-tone, or, you know, depending where I am in the portrait, and that's going to kind of determine, you know, what tone I'm starting with? Well, I think in this case, at this point, I started to work with the dark tones there. Like around right now, what I'm doing at the top, there's a highlight at the very top, and it's weird. It's kind of like a light source, but it's you'll see it as it starts to come along anyway. But I also want to say too that when you work with pastel pencils, you don't really put them in a traditional pencil sharpener. They break very easy. They're very soft. So I do have videos on how I sharpen my pastel pencils. They're more so shorts than anything. But yeah, I use an X-Acto knife, like a box cutter or whatever. And if you look at the bottom left of my screen, that little piece of sandpaper there. And when you are using them and doing little fur textures and the angle that they're at, you don't go through them a lot at all, and they kind of almost you're sharpening them as you use them almost, you know what I mean? You're not really dulling them out, but that's at certain angles. Now if you like bring it up so it's more like vertical, then yeah, you're gonna crush it, and you're gonna need to sharpen it in a matter of seconds. But I follow on Instagram, there's Pastel Masters. It's an Instagram page, and they feature a lot of pastel artists, and I honestly thought there wasn't very many. Well, apparently there is, and there was one artist they featured, and I did look for their actual page, the artist themselves, and they don't have one. They didn't tag that person. They just mentioned their name. And no, I haven't bothered to actually look anymore. Now that I'm thinking of it, I should have, but whatever. He or she, I think it's a he, but they actually cut with the box cutter. They take like almost an inch or 2 inches of wood off of that pencil, and they make that thing so sharp and fine. I don't know how they don't break it or anything, but man, oh man, it's very impressive. I don't think I would ever do it, but you know, because you think if you go too sharp, they're just going to snap, right? But you know, I know that you're not supposed to believe everything you see on the internet, but man, oh man, I've seen it, and he doesn't snap them. But you just want to get them sharp enough anyway that you can get individual little hairs, you know, in where it counts. You know, and if I ever feel like I overdid it, I just go back over it with the softer tone and kind of gently feather it out. You know, if I you know, put too much of a dominant highlight down, or too much of a dominant dark hair or mid-tone, whatever, you know, stuff like that. So and back to the layering thing, it's very forgiving in pastels, you know, as long as you don't press too hard. One thing I will say too, when you're laying in the undertone, like for instance the pan pastels, and you do stencil your drawing, and in this case I generally do with portraits, you can go over, you know, by like ½ inch, a couple centimeters, whatever, over your stencil lines if you're doing the background first. And generally I like to get as close as I can, if not sometimes a little over, because with the pencils you can go right back over top of that. And what it does is, like, the edges, you want to keep this in mind, the edges of the fur, they should feel loose and soft. So you're going to notice I let the fur trail off kind of into the background in spots, especially around the head and the neck. That transition helps to avoid that kind of cutout look, you know what I mean, and makes the portrait feel a little bit more natural, like it's kind of breathing into the paper, if that makes any sense. Man, I'm using some good words. These are gold. So, and like I said, you can even blend some of these areas with your finger or a Q-tip, a small stump, or a little the styrofoam, not the styrofoam, the little sponge tip there, if it starts to look a little busy and too contrasty, too punchy. But just be careful not to smudge everything. And yeah, I'll often blend in the direction of the fur to keep the texture intact. So if you are following along, you can actually pause here if you want, do a small test patch on a scrap piece of paper. Now I don't expect you to have, pastel matte, but use some kind of drawing paper and try 3 or 4 pencil tones, light, mid, dark, and test how they layer over your paper. If you have stick pastels, make an undertone, blend it with your finger, and again, less is more, and then put the pencils over top. It'll help you get a feel for pressure and blending before kind of diving back into your piece, stuff like that, right? comes to this portrait in particular, I actually have a lot of fun getting in these little micro hairs and these little curves where the snout starts to like blend up into the forehead, and you know, the eye sockets there kind of meet into the same spot. There's something about it with all that directional fur, you know, on the snout. They're going straight up onto the forehead, and then you've got like these little furs that go from the eye socket, and they kind of go up towards the forehead, but at the same time the snout hairs kind of go in. You'll know what I'm talking about if you look at your dog, if you've got like a shorter haired dog on the face especially. And then when you get under like the eye and on that cheek, it starts to go the opposite way and go towards their ear and stuff. But this is by far probably one of my favorite spots to tattoo fur, just because it's kind of difficult to get the direction down to make it look believable. But if and when you pull it off, and of course you will, you keep doing it, you're going to pull it off. And the more you do it, the better it's going to look. And it's, for me, it's just really fun. It's just one of those things that I really enjoy doing when I do these kind of pet portraits. And no, that's not including like long-haired animals and stuff, because sometimes animals are different and their fur's different, you know? right, so as you can see, we've moved on to the ear a little bit here. And I'm not going to say it's one of my favorite spots to work on, but in this portrait, it was really fun. It's definitely fun to work on for sure. But the fur here is usually a little longer, a little wispier, and kind of has a more variation in both direction and color. It's where you can really, start to play with the textures a lot, and you don't have to be perfect. And the good thing is with pastels, even if I was to go left to right now with a black pastel pencil right there, I can literally just blend it and then go, from up to down to up, and get the proper direction, whichever direction I need, with a lighter tone, and I can go right over it, assuming you don't press too hard, especially with the dark tones underneath. And it's great. They're so forgiving. And I just love the little kind of textures too in there. It's super fun. So I'm switching to like a slightly softer pastels in between, like you'll notice me with the Carbothellos going back and forth with the Faber-Castells. So when it comes closer to the finished area, like a more finished area, and I'm not 100% being done there, but I will jump over to the Faber-Castells again. They're a little harder of a lead, so they or lead pastel, whatever, so I can get those like little finer details in there. So you're gonna notice how I'm not trying to basically fill in every little space right away with these pencils. Sometimes I try to leave gaps between the strokes, to let the pan pastel or whatever undertone, the underpainting, whatever, peek through. So it acts as like the midtone like I spoke about. So all I'm doing now is just kind of you know, laying in these mid-tones and layering the darker strands and kind of defining shapes, I guess. Right now, these in this part of the ear, they are absolutely a little bit longer of fur here. And you'll notice closer towards the edge of the ear there, it kind of changes with the fur. It's a little bit shorter hair there, but this part of the ear where it's very flat, the center of the ear, they're definitely longer strokes of fur here. Fur, hair, whatever you want to call it. I mean, I know it's fur, but I'm just calling it hair. But yeah, and then I switched it up to this kind of like a walnutty kind of color. It's kind of weird. Walnut, chestnut, whatever. It's a nice tone, but it's definitely got some reds in it for sure. And you can see right here with the pencil, you can absolutely just do any kind of drawing that you want with just pastel pencils as well. And you'll see me blend right there with my finger. But me personally, you go through a lot of pencil very fast when doing this. So a very small piece, you know, or like a palm-sized piece, you'll see me, like I could absolutely just do the entire thing with the pencils. But I don't know. I have fun using the pan pastels and pastel sticks and stuff like that as well. So, but yeah, I mean, it's definitely doable. You're just gonna rip through your a lot of pastel pencil, which means a lot of money. So one thing too that I should mention, so if your ear fur is looking too chunky or uniform, you know, you can break it up. So I will throw in a few shorter directional strokes or flick upward in a different direction just to make it look a little bit more natural. And real fur isn't perfect. It overlaps, it twists and shifts. You know, it shifts directions slightly. Like I said, sometimes it's very messy, you know, depending on the breed. You know, I know there's some people out there that will, you know, get their dog's fur cut and get them haircuts and make them look like these show dogs and stuff with like a perfectly trimmed friggin' hair and stuff. It's kind of weird, but whatever. But, you know, 98% of the population who have, you know, normal people and normal dogs, their hair's just generally all over the place. You know, we don't really groom our dogs very much. Not too often anyway, but and now as you can see, going back into like towards the edge of the ear here, adding in some darker highlights, and I think I'm actually using a black here, and just bringing out that contrast and the shadows and making it look a little bit more believable. And as you can see that I've obviously put some highlights down already, and now when I blend with my finger over top of this dark tone, it kind of blends in with the highlight, so the highlight's not so dominant. So on the bridge of the nose, obviously you see that I've moved over here. In this portrait, in this case, there's lots of little highlights. So that fur is kind of different in texture, you know, than the cheeks and the ears. For the most part, it's tighter, shorter, often flatter against the bone. So I'm switching up my technique a little bit here. The undertones I don't really go crazy with here, but they are there, obviously. But you can see I'm using a very, very, very light pink to do these highlights. And I don't want them to be too dominant. So as you can see, I'm kind of just, you know, pressing them in a little bit. And like I said, everything's very, very, very soft. Like these, the strokes here are really small and controlled, almost like little tick marks, you know, following the shape and contour of the muzzle, you know, up towards the forehead and a little bit into the eye there. And there's, like I said, there's a big highlight on the top anyway. So I'm trying to keep all that in mind. I always try and think of my next move and into the future of the drawing and, you know, where I am, where it's going to meet up to and stuff like that. So, long time no talk, but obviously this is getting into the nose now. It is by far one of the most important features in a pet portrait, along with the eyes. This is where we can kind of bring in a lot of realism and personality. And yeah, that sounds weird with a nose, but it's true. So you always kind of want like this part to kind of feel soft, leathery, and like just a little wet looking, kind of like a real dog nose. You know how it is, man, when you get like a dog close to you and like nudges you with its nose in your hand and you got fucking boogers on your hand and stuff. Yeah, I swear. DrewDrawz swears. Oh boy, if you only followed me on my reaction channel, you would see I'm a whole other person on there. But I try and bring a certain zen to the art channel, you know? But yeah, I'm human. I swear. I cuss. And that's the way it goes. So with the pan pastels, the underpainting, undertones, whatever you want to call it, I started with a, very muted gray, like a mid-tone gray. Like on the cooler gray side. Like a kind of like a neutral browny gray. I don't know, whatever. Anyway, that's what I use to get the basic shape, obviously. And then I do black in the main value areas. Most dog noses are definitely not just all black. There's actually a surprising amount of color and texture in there. Almost like pores and bumps that are actually white and stuff like that, but you're not really going to see them unless the light source hits it at a certain angle, I guess you could say. And depending on the light source, depending on the angle of the head, the face, whatever, there's grays in there, there's purples in there, there's blues in there, there's tons of colors in there actually. So in my head, like I'm identifying the light source, especially in this reference, the light's coming kind of from above, obviously. So I'm keeping the top of that nose just a little bit lighter, but not like directly on the edge. And the bottom sides are obviously going to be a little bit deeper and richer in tone. Switching back and forth from dark pencils, light pencils, closer to black, with the dark ones. But pure black, obviously, where, the inside of the nostrils and stuff are. Lightly tapping, kind of the nostrils with that black and then, smudging it in, if that makes any sense with my finger, within those crease lines too. On the nose itself on the top there, you have to kind of use like short curved strokes kind of to follow the surface texture. It kind of usually has like a subtle pebbled kind of dimpled look, and that's what I was talking about, like pores almost and like little bumps, right? I guess lack of better words would be like pebbled or dimples, but it's also easy to overdo it. So you got to blend really gently. And, in this case, I just do it with my finger, and probably my pinky finger since it's the smallest one. And it's just to soften those transitions a little bit, So think about it like skin. It's smooth, but with like tiny little textures, But sometimes, like, you don't want some things crazy, hyper realistic in certain areas, because I find it kind of takes away from, other things that could be the center of attention, the center of focus. And on this piece in particular, the first thing, even right now without it being finished, the first thing that your eye goes to is the eye. So obviously the nose is detailed, but it's not crazy, the dimpled look. It's not, it's just not about, the nose here. It's obviously about the eye. So. So now obviously I'm going to be putting in, a little bit of a highlight on the top of that nose. That's going to be on the more light pink to white, and that's on the bridge of the nose. And then on the top of the head there, it's obviously like a peachy pink color. And around the nose and the mouth jaw area there, we're going in with a really light pink, kind of peachy color, and with some whites and maybe even like a little hint of light ochres with a little bit of yellow, like a banana yellow kind of, I guess. Yeah, so from here on out, it's basically just little details, and I'm gonna finish up that his left ear, so the ear we see on our right, and some textures on his chest area, the neck area, meeting into the chest, and yeah, we're gonna throw in some some darker tones, some blacks, some more browns and tan colors, and obviously the highlights from there, and get some more fur textures in there. So I'm just going to leave it at that for the voiceover, and I'm just going to play some music in the background and enjoy the rest of the drawing. And if you watch this entire thing, I just want to say thank you, and thank you for your continued support. And this is something new that I'm trying out with these voiceovers. Now, if this is something you want me to keep doing, maybe let me know in the comments, or comment on this video and let me know, and maybe I'll put up a poll later on my page, and we can take a vote, I guess. And yeah, there's going to be a vlog video coming with this one too, so I'm really enjoying those as well, and I'm going to keep going with them for sure. But yeah, thank you for your support, and we'll see you on the next one.